My guest today is a market designer and game theorist who is working on a better economic system. But before they got into their career in finance, they trained in nuclear engineering. So it's a bit of a jump already. After college, during the peak of the dot-com boom, they started working for tech startups, and this spawned a fascination of the mathematics of information and computation. Currently, they're working as a market design consultant, and they have patent work, I think is the correct phrase, but you can correct me on that, on a better commodity market design. Noah Healy, welcome to the show. Before we talk about the market design, tell me about that jump from nuclear engineering into technology and into the dot-com boom. Why the seemingly sudden change?
Well, basically, I needed a job. I had sort of fallen into nuclear engineering in the first place because I went to college basically just because that was the thing to do. I grew up in a university town. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is where I'm from, and the University of Virginia, which is uh, we have a few institutions that are a lot older than it, but it's sort of top two public institutions in the country, is right here. And so I started taking classes at UVA while I was still in high school because our local high school had a program that would send people to continuing ed if they continued a course of study. And they also had several pilot programs for accelerating mathematical study that I was a part of. And as a result of that, I wound up a few years ahead of grade level. And so the last 2 years of high school, I was taking math classes at UVA. So it was a fairly natural thing to just keep going to college, keep taking math. And the nuclear engineering department had by far the most interesting instructors. And just trying to find some way to be useful. Energy production is obviously a very fundamental part of what makes economies function. So that seemed like a sort of reasonable course to be on. Of course, there aren't a lot of jobs in nuclear engineering in this country. And when I got out of college and needed to have a job, it was 2000. So getting jobs in for tech startups was sort of a can you fog a mirror type of a thing. I actually knew the CTO at a local company who was a part of the games club at UVA, which I was the president of. And so I'd been mostly beating him in games for a few years. And so he figured I must be smart, brought me down. I did the interview. Most interviews in the tech space are sort of very truncated IQ tests to see if you can solve logic problems. I'm pretty good at logic problems, so I can slide through those pretty easy. And so then the sort of engineering training kicks in, and I started studying that underlying mathematics, and just found a real calling because that mathematics is, if anything, even more fundamental than energy.
That's actually you mentioned there with the jobs. Like I assume from my layman perspective that nuclear engineering would be one of those careers that you kind of want to go into because you imagine it's a safe career with a lot of jobs, like how people might go into traditionally might go into law because you typically get a high paying job. So it's surprising for me to find out that there's not many jobs in that field.
The difficulty with nuclear engineering as a job in this country is that the industry itself is being pushed out. In fact, the the department that I joined, I was the very last person to join the department in the history of UVA because the board of visitors, which is what they sort of call their guidance council of people that effectively run the university, just disliked the entire concept of nuclear energy and were, disgusted, revolted at the fact that there was a functioning reactor on grounds, and so forced them to turn it off and decommission it and make the program go away. We're not building new reactors in this country, and the Navy trains operators to run its nuclear navy. So that's where the primary operator uh, source comes from. I probably could have gone for some sort of naval commissioning, path, but the .com boom was rushing, and a friend sort of immediately offered me a job as soon as I mentioned that I was about to graduate, and so just path of least resistance.
Fair dues, fair dues. I'm gonna make you feel old now. Around the .com boom, I was 7 years old. Um, so do with that information what you will. So tell me about that job you got straight out of college.
I was working for a company that had been formed by a few people, including Merv Griffin's ex-wife. So if you're familiar with Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, his company created those. She and her sister invented television game shows. In fact, she has a co-credit for creating Jeopardy. Um, the two of them were on a flight apparently when the quiz show scandal hit, and she came up with the idea sort of in jest, uh, since everyone was terrified about giving the answers away. What if you made a show where that was just the gimmick, that you gave people the answers up front, and sort of took the sting out of the scandal that way. So they had created a social gaming platform, on mostly AOL and Prodigy, and we're starting to see some success, and we're growing very rapidly. And so I had a few different jobs. One was the email system, so sending out the customized monthly newsletters to their user base, and building out a templating system to allow the people in marketing to build the kinds of newsletters and the kind of customization they wanted. And another project, they had multiple web servers, and so people's sessions would show up on the web servers, and they wanted a thing to merge these logs into a single picture of user experience, that they could also spread out. My friend had actually written the first draft of just about everything by himself, and so they were tracking, I believe it was 20 key pages on the site, but they actually had a little over 200 pages that they wanted tracked. And the other problem was that the overhead of the algorithm he was using meant that it was taking more than a day to produce one day's worth of information. And they wanted that fixed up, particularly because the growth meant that the amount of data that they were going to processing. I was actually only there for a year before they had mass layoffs, because of course the peak of the boom was immediately followed by the crash.
Yeah.
But their data volume more than quadrupled just during my tenure of about 11 months.
So could it be said that that volume of and here's where the British and the Americans are coming in with that volume of data, it sort of influenced your later work?
Well, the thing that really hooked me in, there were a couple of projects where I started learning the power of algorithms, and I was able to reduce the time that it took to do that job by a factor of about 100. But the real thing was I was able to reduce the memory footprint of that job on the system by a factor of well over 1,000. So sort of 100 times faster at 1,000 times less space. Uh, and there was another sort of emergency project where had to parse out of the mail logs. We had a situation where the mail server effectively crashed, and so only some of the mails had gone out, and we needed to know which people had been mailed so we wouldn't be spamming them. And the crash logs were very useless, actually. Um, it was emails getting into a bad state, and so it'd be a line saying, I'm having a problem, and then a reference, and then there'd be a line, 6,000 lines later in the log, which was the reference string saying, yep, still having a problem, and then a new reference, and that was 5 to 10 deep, and some of them would eventually deliver, and some of them wouldn't. So I needed to build something that would reconstruct all of those, read a line, find out what its next step is going to be, keep a record, check where that's going to, check whether or not this is a new thing or another thing type situation. And that one, by using about 5 different kinds of algorithmic improvements, I was able to get more than 1,000,000x speed improvement.
Nice.
So learning that that's possible really changes your perceptions about what you should be doing in order to be productive.
Because that's obviously, it sounds like that has influenced your commodity market design. Um, so before we move on to that, um, for those of us who don't know anything about the financial system, uh, what do we currently have, and what are you proposing?
Absolutely. So marketplaces are trying to figure out how to get people that make stuff and people that need to use that stuff to come together at a price. This is sort of the broad theory. And so the way that they do this is everyone who's willing to sell shows up and says how much they're willing to sell for. Everyone who's willing to buy shows up and says how much they're willing to buy for. And the system puts these 2 groups in lines. And the front of each line, if the lines sort of intersect on their prices at the front, then those trades actually happen. So if you're willing to sell for $1 and I'm willing to buy for $1.50, then the market will find a way to get us together and make us make a deal. The trick is that those lines don't really cross like that. So what's actually going on is, I'm willing to buy for $1 and you're willing to sell for $1.50. And neither of us really wants to cross that chasm because we're losing by doing that. If you come all the way over to me this second, maybe I'd have been willing to come all the way over to you the next second, and you're leaving 50 cents on the table. And so there's this sort of virtual tug of war going. Now, of course, what makes this more complicated in the real world is that it's not just you and me, sort of playing chicken with each other. There's actually tens of thousands of trading firms that are putting in orders. And they have very powerful computer algorithms that are analyzing information streams from around the world. And the system is actually capable of updating itself in a microsecond. So 1,000,000 times a second, these lines are forming and then being blown up as people look at the form and they're like, whoa, I don't want to be, third in line when it looks like this. I'll put in this. Oops, now I'm 5th in line. No, I was trying to be 4th in line, as everyone jockeys and rejockeys and re-jockeys for position. So this creates a very complicated practical situation right now. What I'm proposing is a system where there's 2 different kinds of marketplaces that are being glued together. In the first place, there's a sort of forecasting negotiation market where people are attempting to plot out a course of where prices are and where they're going. And in the second place, there's a delivery clearinghouse where people can see this plotted course and make overtures based on that course. So when you're making a choice about committing to a trade, the price has already been fixed. And when you have speculation about what will happen in the future, then what you're doing is adding information to a system that's trying to stabilize prices.
All right. Where does this information come from? Does that come from the buyers, the sellers, or perhaps a third party? Where does it come from?
It comes from literally everybody, actually. So it's this piece is a little hard to wrap your head around, but we collectively know more than any one of us individually knows. So each of us has sort of a little piece of reality. Some people have bigger pieces, some people have smaller pieces. Some people are so delusional that they have no contact with reality at all. But everyone sort of has a little piece of reality. And in order to get our businesses to sort of operate effectively, they need to have access to this sort of big, clear picture of reality, much bigger than any one of them has alone. And so the goal of this forecasting market is to create a very high rate of return environment where almost anybody with almost any size piece of reality has a positive incentive to throw their 2 cents in and see how it stacks up. And so that's who will come to that party.
All right. Because from my sort of like, I try to understand the paper. Bear in mind, I'm just a simple social scientist. So from my understanding, I think I might have this slightly wrong, that everyone who provides information will sort of get some kind of return, or like it's lower of a risk. I mean, guide me through this, because I'm probably going down the wrong path.
Okay, sure. Well, so the risk profile, let's talk about sort of now versus proposal. So right now, there are certain kinds of things that you can do where you effectively have an unlimited risk. And if you've heard of naked shorting, that's when you sell something that you don't own.
Yeah.
On the prospect that you'll buy it back later. Well, how much is it going to cost later? You don't know. Nobody knows. So under those circumstances, you have unlimited risk. And in general, in the existing system, people are trading on what's known as margin. So they have a certain amount of risk involved. And as long as the equity of their positions is good enough, then the market will let them keep going.
Yeah.
This was, if you saw The Big Short, when everybody was sort of, being mad at the shorts when they were sort of holding fast and things were still going against them. If you have a position that's currently wrong, but you're sure it's going to be right in the future, you have to have enough money so that you'll be able to pay off your counterparties. And if the market's basically allowed to look inside your pocket to see how much money you've got. If you don't have enough money, then what they'll do is they'll liquidate your position. They'll just go into the market, sell it off, pay off your counterparties. It's over. So if you're going to be right tomorrow, but today you're wrong enough that you can't cover your counterparties, then you'll get wiped out today. You'll lose all the money now. And tomorrow, the fact that you were right doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
That kind of scenario where you're at risk for more money than you've actually invested doesn't exist in my marketplace. On the other hand, you could still be wiped out for the money that you did invest. So if you're just 100% wrong, if you're one of these fully delusional folks that just has no idea what's going on, you said up and everyone else on earth said down, and then you're just totally wrong. And then the system is going to take your investment and split it up and use it to pay off the people who had to correct the mistake you made. But every little bit of correct that you are counts in your favor in my system. Because we're measuring information, we can sort of take the bad from the good. So if you think about like any kind of measurement, there's a little bit of error at the end of it. If you're trying to figure out how wide a doorway is, you pull out the tape measure. Maybe you're not perfectly flat and you're a little cockeyed. There's going to be a little error there.
Yeah.
But most of what you're measuring is correct. It's about this wide. You're going to be 90%, 99% correct. What this system does is, because it's sort of measuring the length of what you're doing and then figuring out which part of that length was correct. If none of it was correct, then it's zero. Then you get nothing. But if 1% of it was correct, then you get 1% of the money you're expecting back. If it was 90%, then you get 90% of the money you're expecting back. And so when you pair that up with an extremely high rate of return, then you get some really amazing things. So if you set up a CDM that has, say, 100% annualized rate of return, and somebody's making a prediction for 10 years from now, then their expected return on that investment is a factor of 1,024. If that prediction is 1% correct, then they're not going to get 1,024% or 1,024x back, but they will get 10.24% X back. And 10x on a 10-year investment, that's still a lot better than most people do on 10-year investments. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where even if you've got sort of a tiny piece of the world and a small contribution to make, there's still going to be economically viable and personally valuable slots in the system for people to be able to toss in their opinions and knowledge.
So it sort of sounds like, as well, everyone is kind of making predictions as they go along. So we've got traders who will be buying commodities. You've got suppliers. I remember in a video you told that you sent, there was also a third group.
So yeah, I identify sort of three separate critical players. There's the producers, there's the consumers, and then there's the sort of informed forecasters, which are sort of hats the producers and consumers can wear, but also other people. Existing, hedge funds have researchers. That would be part of it. Reporters, people in government. If there's a new set of regulations coming down the pike, or a new negotiation for imports or shutting down imports coming up, you might know a lot about the future of beef or oil. And so all of those different potential sources of information can come together and be integrated into sort of one super mind of planning for the future.
And I think, if I recall correctly, that supermind is the algorithm. How much can you tell me about that?
Okay. So the integration basically is looking at a distance function for functions. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
Functions you might be used to from school as sort of squiggly lines on graph paper.
Yeah.
And that is more or less what functions are at sort of a very basic level. We can talk about the distance between two things in a bunch of different ways. And if you've used online mapping systems, it'll tell you, you need to go from here to there. Here's like 3 different proposals for how you can do it. And, it'll say, this is the best, that's the shortest. What's the difference between the best and the shortest? Well, traffic maybe. And perhaps better than the algorithm, so you can go in and kind of drag things around. And when you do, it'll pop up, how long it thinks that will take, or how many miles that new thing is. Those kinds of differences give you a sense of what's going on when you're measuring the difference between 2 functions. What I'm doing is using a pretty basic algorithm to effectively measure how many bits difference there are between the description of one squiggly line and another squiggly. So by measuring it in bits or some other information space thing, that's where we have an information quantification, where we can get that measurement out and figure out whether it's right or wrong. And so within that context, the marketplace doesn't care whether or not you're moving prices up or down. It cares whether or not you're moving prices towards their correct value or away from their correct value. And it doesn't know what those are yet. So it's going to assume that you're correct, charge you an investment fee based on integrating your information as if it were correct. And then once it actually gets used by producers and consumers trading, then whichever price winds up, wherever the price winds up and is actually getting used, that is now the correct price. And we can now compare each person's guesses with this new final point of, now I know what the right answer was. So we can just go back in and check, was your answer always towards correct? Was it always away from correct? Was it towards correct a little bit? And we can measure that directly.
And talking of checking the guesses, if I understand it correctly, everybody can check everything. Like the data is open for analysis.
Yes, it's fully public, and this creates a strong incentive to stabilize, because once you see everybody else's guesses, then you can take that information on board with what you know and create a new guess. And so perhaps you're somewhat familiar with sort of sample sizes. You said social scientists.
Yeah.
There's a general principle that there's a sort of quadratic relationship. If you want twice the accuracy, you need 4 times the sample size.
Mm-hmm.
If you want 10 times the accuracy, you need 100 times the sample size. But what this does is it would let, say, a sample of 100 people take a look at the first 100 guesses, at the end of the first day. And then each one of those people, with effectively 100 people's worth of information going in each, can now make a new set of guesses, which creates a pseudo-effective 10,000 person sample size. But that's after one day. After a second day, it would be 1 million person effective sample size, 100 million, and so on. So effectively every day, a new firm digit shows up from 100 people. And that works because everybody has a positive incentive towards this final product of collective stability. And so that creates a very sort of powerful system of forecast and control.
Epic. It's sort of like, I'm stealing a phrase from the tech world, like open source.
Kind of. Yeah, the project itself actually is open source overseas. So you had mentioned the patent work. I'm doing patent work in the United States, but because international patents cost millions of dollars and are very complex, and I'm having enough trouble just with the USPTO, the project is open source overseas. And open source has a lot of advantages for security purposes.
All right, epic. I feel like that's a pretty thorough introduction to the CDM there. So let's move on a little bit now. And something in the notes that that you mentioned, and I'm really interested to talk about this, is economics as information. What's your perspective? And do you want to tell me? Do you want to tell me about what you do?
Yeah, sure. So the the critical thing I think to understand is that we see the buying and selling of goods, and so we see sort of money changing hands for services or products, and we say that's economics. But there's a third factor that we aren't really paying attention to that's sort of hidden behind those first two factors. Um, that if we pull it out, makes the entire thing a lot clearer. And that is information. Um, there's information embedded in the product about product quality and so on. There's information embedded in money itself, where money is essentially measuring value. It's the unit of measurement for value that we have. Um, and so, what an economy is doing is very imperfectly managing the information of our capacities and desires and trying to find systems of co-compatibility of those things. Uh, so, Elon Musk wants to live on Mars. We, the species of humanity, does not have the technological capacity to build Martian colonies right now. He's working on it. Maybe we'll see. But but if we didn't have that capacity, he won't get his wish. And if nobody had that wish, we would never develop that capacity. Like it would be sort of pointless to try to figure out how to build Martian colonies if everyone on Earth was sort of permanently never leaving ground.
Yeah.
So separating out that aspect of things of communication allows us to understand that what we're actually doing is very clunky and very noisy, because money is also tied up in our political system and credit systems and a bunch of opaque companies that do a lot of things that are very bad and very insecure. Uh, and that's at the heart of uh, how we're measuring the system that provides us our bacon and eggs in the morning. So that's not perhaps ideal. Also, the product quality. We've seen a sort of vast expansion of the retail system over the last couple of centuries, as products have evolved and become more sophisticated. But then they've also separated. So now you need much greater expertise to be able to choose between different products. And companies exploit that failure of expertise. And we have the whole right to fix things movement. I don't know if that's the same kind of deal in Europe as it is in the United States, but there's a sort of vociferous counter-revolutionary force against companies like Apple, or even Tesla, of people who want to be able to buy things and own them and change them however they want to change them, and companies that are like, we're going to take your money and you'll move around with this product in the world, but we want control over that physical object indefinitely. And if we decide you shouldn't have it anymore, well, we're just going to take it away from you.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that other perspective on like economics as communication, because my limited understanding was sort of more of the traditional role. So in effect, somebody would be working for whatever company. We call them Goldman Sachs or whatever. This first one I can think off the top of my head. And they would look at the data, they would look at the markets and what's currently happening, who's buying, who's selling, and then they would almost present to the decision makers, well, what does this actually mean? It's really interesting to see that other side.
Yeah. Well, in particular, because once you start thinking about the marketplaces as mass communication systems, which is a much fairer description of them than sort of their general conception these days as some sort of, pack of cannibalistic piranhas or something, is that as information systems, they are abject failures. They used to work very well, but we're now having frequent serial continent scale credit crises, asset valuation crises, all sorts of things. And when you dig into them as information systems, it becomes immediately obvious what's going on. That microsecond dance that I was talking about earlier, that's now possible, and that extremely large scale filtering of information by not particularly intelligent algorithms, but still functionally, tactically useful algorithms, because human beings have much narrower awareness, means that there is a great deal more noise in the marketplace than there used to be. And so, whereas, say, prior to telegraphy, the markets functioned generally better, and might have been likened in some way to, say, a symphony orchestra. Now we've replaced sort of every second violin with a jackhammer, and we're still trying to listen to the same compositions, and we can't hear them anymore.
Yeah, it's just really interesting just to learn about something that I know nothing about. So I'm really grateful for you being incredibly patient with me regarding this. And you also mentioned that we've had at least a few sort of like major economic events. Like off the top of my head, I can think of the dot-com crash, the housing market crash in 2007. I think I was about 14, 15 when that happened. And then more recently, we've had coronavirus, and I don't know what it's like over there in the UK. We're calling it over there in the USA, I should say. We're calling it the cost of living crisis.
Inflation is bad here as well, but that's sort of not alone. The China is having a banking issue right now, where one of their regional banks committed fraud and lost most of its depositors' money. And in response to this, there's apparently a growing movement to stop mortgage payments on properties that have not yet been built, because they were creating mortgages before the project actually got off the ground. How big or small that turns out to be remains to be seen, but Evergreen, one of their large property developers, something like half a year ago, had a very near miss of a few $1 billion on its major bonds. And there's a lot of questions about whether or not that would be a moment, if they did miss, similar to the 2007 crisis. So China might be in the early stages of a crisis like the 2007 crisis. There was also, in the early 90s, a Japanese property crisis, which the Japanese market hasn't really recovered from since. And again, about half a year ago, the Japanese central bank became the first central bank in human history to own more than half of the bond market. So half of all loans, effectively, in the Japanese economy are in fact being held by their central bank. That's kind of a tipping point in terms of where you're going. it's not confined to the northern developed world. Zimbabwe rather famously had a severe bout of hyperinflation several years ago, and you can acquire for a very modest fee a $10 trillion bill from Zimbabwe that is perhaps appropriately the sigil on it is three rocks stacked on one another, and then a one followed by 14 zeros up in the corner. The nickel market was actually shut down not too long ago because of a short squeeze that that would have bankrupted the world's largest stainless steel manufacturer had it been allowed to go forward. About 5 years ago, the beef market in the United States collapsed for about 6 months and was untraded. So they don't make news as frequently as they once did, but there actually are a lot of serious dislocations, and that's leaving out the very clearly fraudulent dislocations which have occurred. Things like the savings and loan banking crisis that caused the crash in '87, or the potentially very severe long-term capital management failure, which was in '97. We're seeing markets becoming much less stable. Just last week, I was talking to a Indian rice trader out of Dubai, and he was mentioning that the rice market in sort of the South Asia region was up over 30% year on year. So, think about your grocery bill, think about plus 30%. I'm not quite there yet in this country, but people are. Of course, the Sri Lanka situation, where their country is more or less disintegrated. The not having awareness of how to cooperate with each other to match up our capacities with our desires means mismatching those things. And that can get almost arbitrarily bad. One of the great natural experiments of the 20th century was the Soviet system of Eastern Europe and the USSR and China before they decided to start using external markets to guide themselves, where bureaucratic systems would just by diktat declare what the economy was and wasn't to do. And they killed tens of millions of people by starvation and privation because their plans didn't accord with reality, and reality always wins those things.
Yeah, it's and adding to all of this as well. I was watching a documentary a few weeks ago that was talking about the banking crisis we had in 2007, 2008. And it took a deep dive into what our chancellor at the time, Alistair Darling, who had the biggest eyebrows you've ever seen, how he effectively went to the 11th hour with the banks. He got all of the major banks in the UK in one room, because I believe RBS was, I can't remember exactly what they're doing, you probably know more than me, effectively caused the crisis, or at least sort of was a big player in it. So it's really interesting just to talk to someone and be like, oh, what does that actually mean for us?
Well, so that's actually the 2007 banking crisis that sort of went around the world is an excellent example of precisely the kind of recursion damage that the market is so very prone to. Basically, what happened was that by creating these mortgage products where you could bundle together a bunch of mortgages and create a very safe investment, they expanded the marketplace for mortgage credit. But what that did is it created inflation in housing prices. But people don't think of all inflation as equal. So if I've got like an old master up on my wall and it's worth $100,000 and next year it's worth $100 million, I don't say to myself, oh, inflation is out of control. It's insane that this thing is worth 1,000 times what it used to be. I say, oh, my taste is so fantastic. The rest of the world has caught up to understanding that I'm right about this. And the same thing happens with people's housing prices. The people who own houses see their house value go up by 10% in a year, 20% in a year, and they don't say, oh, the financial system has lost its collective mind. These people are criminally destroying my country's ability to have an economy. They say, oh, let me get a bank loan and take a vacation. and that just exacerbates the issue, because the more credit that's in the system and available for these, the higher the prices can go. If somebody's got a 10% mortgage on a house that's worth $100,000, $10,000, and then the house is suddenly worth $200,000, well, why shouldn't they be able to take out another $10,000? And if they do that to redo their bathroom, and a fresh bathroom means the house is worth another $100,000, why shouldn't you give them another and just keep going? And they're changing the tile and nobody really cares in the first place. So you like it, but value is about what we collectively believe. And so we got into this situation where increasing the value of the marketplace inflated the underlying assets, which caused the entire marketplace to expand. And that's classic bubble behavior. When the market's behavior affects its own outcomes, then you get this sort of walking on air sensation, which feels really great until, like Wile E. Coyote, you look down and realize that, it's the Grand Canyon out there, and the rock has fallen on your head. And so, yeah, the companies that were doing the very best in that environment of spinning this wheel to make everything as bad as possible, as quickly as possible, were doing the very best of all the companies. And then they crashed the very hardest of all the companies, because everything that they'd been doing was actually making things worse.
Yeah. Thank you so much for letting me sort of learn about economics and inflation. And I learned definitely more than I was expecting to learn. So thank you for that. Before we round off, I finish every podcast with a questionnaire. Very different to the questionnaire I sent you over email. And they come from the Proust Questionnaire, which is, we're talking late 19th century now. It was later adapted by Bernard Pivot and then by James Lipton on Inside the Actors Studio. And now I'm presenting my adaptation to yourself. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word? Probably coom. It's the hardest hangman word. It's the only English word that has no vowels in it. And it actually shows up in The Lord of the Rings. I believe at some point during the Return of the King, Sam and Frodo find themselves in a coom. A coom, CWM, is a borrowed word from Welsh, I believe. And it's a sort of narrow and steep-sided gully.
Okay, that's actually generally interesting. Would you think any less of me if I said I've only watched half of the first movie?
That's completely fine. I'm sad to say that I'm not a massive Lord of the Rings fan. I did read the books as a child and found them relatively dull. I think the real key to those books is the people who love Aragorn like them a lot, and I didn't. And I think the bits in the Shire are the best. I love The Hobbit, and that's I think the Hobbits are the best of Tolkien, although I recognize and am aware that there's vastly more, and it's not the thing that he primarily cared about.
All right, what is your least favorite word?
I don't really have that kind of relationship with words. Um, style, style is so underdefined. We use it in an enormous number of contexts to mean everything from uh, individual idiosyncrasy to sort of collective states of approval. And at no point is it ever defined. And of course, it's also uh, a gap in offense.
Have we got style here? I think we got style though. We say we've got style. What engages you?
I find computational mathematics and reason in general highly engaging. Um, I'm also a fan of Silver Age science fiction and film. Uh, Probably own something like 500 or 600 movies and something like 2,000 books.
Nice. This is an audio podcast, but you've just seen a smile on my face when you mentioned Silver Age film. What disengages you?
Writing just instantaneously disengages my brain. It does not like doing that at all.
What sound or noise do you love?
The opening to the Brandenburg Concerto, that always raises my mood. Or Vivaldi, that's something about Baroque structural things. That's always enjoyable.
It unlocks something inside, doesn't it? It sort of just gets you going.
Yeah, it really does.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Do you guys have oh, what are those damn things called? The the name's escaping me for a second. There's this insect that's the longest living insect in the world. They have like a 17-year life cycle. They burrow under the ground, then they all come out at once. Cicadas. You guys have cicadas?
I've heard of them. I'm not sure. I'm gonna Google that.
If you were 7 in 2000, then it's been 29 years, and so cicadas would have come out in your lifetime. And if cicadas had come out in your lifetime, you would know that you had them.
Okay.
So crickets chirping away in the field, that can get loud and irritating if you're out in the country. Um, Cicadas, imagine if they were so loud that in the middle of the city it was like crickets were nesting in your ears. That they have this kind of rush strategy where they're burrowed underground at like tree roots, and every 17 or 23 or 19 years they all emerge at once, and they go up and they sit on tree branches and they just rattle as loudly as they possibly can, and it's just unbelievable. It's how like emergency like bullhorns specifically choose like dissonant tones to cut through.
Yeah.
That's the sort of frequency they operate on, but it's not like the ambulance going past and then it's gone, and at least you did a good deed by getting out of the way. It's just constant and incessant. It lasts for weeks. It doesn't slow down or stop for nighttime. It's just there and it's on. It's when it's hot outside. It's just awful.
Talking of insects flooding back, you've just unlocked an old memory of mine where I used to live in Lincolnshire, particularly in the south of Lincolnshire, and that is just flat. It's below sea level and it's flat. And because of that, we had loads of ditches that were dug. And I remember, and this just makes, I don't know what this makes you sound like, but I remember I used to catch grasshoppers. Um, so just go out and just sort of like catch them for a little bit and then release them again. So yeah, you just brought a memory flooding back. Question 7. What is your favorite curse word?
I don't really curse that often. Uh, as a computer scientist and mathematician, my most damning phrase is usually suboptimal.
I'm gonna adopt that one actually for myself. 'Cause it sounds so sophisticated, doesn't it? I could just say, "Look at you, you're suboptimal." Actually, I might do that when I go see my siblings again. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, just about anything really. The Sherlock Holmes, being a consultant detective, that would be fun. I've never really had the fantasy of having a job at any point. Uh, I've just sort of, well, we talked about it before, sort of path of least resistance. I need to have an income. Oh, there's an opportunity. Go for that. Um, so different opportunities unfolding in front of me, I could very easily see myself going and doing some other things. Uh, but actually wanting to do these things, like it doesn't really gel for me. I can't close that connection. I don't know. Maybe some sort of think tank expert or something that might work for me.
All right, maybe this one will be a bit easier. What profession would you not like to do?
Sales. I've been doing that
Yeah,
for a while, and I'm bad at it, and it's hard to do. So yeah, I'd rather get out.
yeah, yeah. Same. I did sales for a little bit. Just no, no. Final question. If you could only say one statement to any one person, what would that statement be, and who would that person be?
Only a single statement.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's a toughie. Uh, I mostly speak my mind to people when and as I can. So boiling things down to single statements, uh, I don't have much for that. I guess just for anybody, read Turing's paper on general computation. It's the most profound idea that humanity has ever produced.
Hmm. And we mentioned before I live in Milton Keynes. I'm literally about 5-10 minute drive from Bletchley Park. Um, I've got a friend who works there as well. Noah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being really patient with me and helping me sort of understand economics just a little bit more. And I hope also that our listeners have picked up something new.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. This was a lot of fun.
Yay. You have just listened to a production of Tom Meets Interesting People. If you are interested in taking part in this podcast, or you know somebody that might make a great guest, please email us at tommeetsinterestingpeople@gmail.com and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Guests may provide material which demonstrates their work. It is the understanding that this material does not infringe on the copyright of others, and the guest has signed a release form confirming that they have obtained permission for the copyrighted material to be played on this podcast. All other rights reserved. Copyright 2022.